This will be the first in a series of videos about the history of the United States of America. It is a biblical idea to recount the history of one's nation. Now, this history that I'm giving obviously will be from a Bible believer's viewpoint of the words that were uttered by the people who lived during their time period. Americans have a very skewed understanding of the true history of the United States of America. It is a biblical idea to recount the history of one's nation. Moses summarized the birthright and covenant of Israel in Deuteronomy. Solomon recounted the history of Israel at the dedication of the Jewish temple. Many of the Psalms will review the history of Israel, as did the prophets on certain occasions. Nehemiah summarized the history of Israel during the revival, for the revival of the post-captivity. Stephen rehearsed the history of Israel when he preached the final message to Israel in Acts chapter 7 before their blindness occurred for the church time period. Now, my intent is to give real, honest, valid history, not revisionist history. Many of the history books that people read, especially in the public schools, contain hearsay. And it's the hearsay of the author or the editors, and in most cases, actual revisionists of the history. The leftists are trying to get America to forget the past. They're lying about it. If you have an honest bone in your body, you're going to have to see from the information that I give is that the heritage of this nation is truly a Christian heritage. Often, the victors of a war will be the ones who write the history books. Why? It's because they need to justify their reason for killing of people, especially in what is commonly called the Civil War, which wasn't real civil. Now, when you read a history book or when you seek to understand the true history of a nation, it's best to go right back to the people and find words that were written about them personally or words that were spoken and then put in print so you can get it right from the source instead of through a series of hearsay. Now, obviously, no nation is perfect, okay, because all nations consist of imperfect people. But the true heritage of this nation, the United States of America, is truly based upon a Christian heritage. Now, were these Christians perfect and sound in their doctrine? Well, the obvious answer is no. They had many flaws. They had many doctrinal flaws. But, hey, still the Lord uses imperfect people. Now, another thing, especially in this country, when you read the Bible from a Bible believer's viewpoint, you see that whenever there's a revival or an awakening, when God has a moving and is enlightening people, and people sincerely are seeking after the truth, the devil always shows up to counterfeit it. Now, in this country, you could obviously see history from a Christian viewpoint, but at the same time, running parallel, you can see a satanic influence in this country. At the same time, they're side by side, walking side by side. This is why if you go to any public buildings, you'll see symbolism for Christianity. And you also see symbolism for Satanism and or the Illuminati. And the reason why that is true is because there's counterfeits in religion and politics, which causes massive confusion, deception, and this deception causes grave offenses, and then people want to revise history to try to make it fit in their little mode. Now, where I'm going to start in the history of this nation is back in the early 1600s. I'm not going to start with Columbus because he went down to the Caribbean, South and Central America. I'm going to focus on the colonists who actually landed on North America, eventually becoming the United States of America. So what was first off, the political foundation of the colonists? Well, you can find online a copy of the Magna Carta, signed in 1215, and so that would be an early political foundation or the mindset of these people. The Magna Carta, 1215. And then if you look up the Mayflower Compact, okay, looking at the Pilgrims. Now, obviously, they're not the first, not the absolute first, but still, the Mayflower Compact of 1620, I'm going to view it a little bit later. This is a political agreement between the Pilgrims. Okay, and it starts off in the name of God. Amen. We, whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, by the grace of God. And then it says, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. Okay, so you're going to accept those words to be exactly what their real desire was? For the advancement of the Christian faith. Didn't say Muslim, didn't say secular, didn't say Buddhist, didn't say Hinduist, didn't say Catholic. The Christian faith. Now, just prior to them, just a little bit earlier to them, the very first permanent English settlement was established in Jamestown, Virginia. Now, the Pilgrims thought that they were going to settle in the northern parts of Virginia, but they landed further north, which eventually became Plymouth, Massachusetts. Okay, now, these people, these colonists came here, they were under contract, okay, by the charters of who they agreed to. That was their political setting. They were under a business contract. Okay, now a little bit later in 1689, the English Bill of Rights were established. And of course, that provided a little bit of a foundation for the colonists or the new nation. Okay, to give you visual evidence for today to verify what I've already said, 400 years ago, when the Pilgrims landed and then made the Mayflower Compact, in the Indiana Code, under what's called hierarchy of law. I'm not sure how many states have this, but I'm going to show you what we have in Indiana. It's on the screen, hierarchy of law, and it states, Section 1, the law governing this state is declared to be, okay, first, Constitution of the United States and of this state. Second, all statutes of the General Assembly of the state in force and not inconsistent with such constitutions. Third, all statutes of the United States in force and related to subjects over which Congress has power to legislate for the states and not inconsistent with the Constitution for the United States. Now, I'm not going to get into the particulars of this. I'm not really a total agreement the way they're being written, but okay, we'll leave it go at that. But notice number 4, the fourth. The common law of England and the statutes of the British Parliament made in aid thereof prior to the 4th year of the reign of James the First, and then after the parentheses, and which are of general nature, not local to that kingdom, and not inconsistent with the first and second and third specifications of this section. Okay, so there we go. That's taking us back to King James. You say, now you may quickly say, well, James, rah, 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 rah. Okay, nobody's perfect. God uses imperfect men. Get over it. Okay, so we're going to focus on these colonies. And here is what an Argentinian president stated about the explorers who came to North America versus the ones who came to South America. He said, South America was settled by the Spanish who came to South America in search of gold. But North America was settled by the Pilgrim Fathers who went there in search of God. Now that is a great summary of the differences between Christopher Columbus going to the Caribbean, Central America, South America in search of gold, where the Pilgrims came here in search of God. Okay, to verify that statement, the second part or second aspect of this video is the religious foundation of the colonists. Okay, the first, as I've stated, the first permanent English settlement occurred at Jamestown, Virginia, on the River James in 1607. Okay, so just 13 years before the Pilgrims. At that time, in 1607, that's when the translators of King James was working on the translation of the King James Bible, 1604 to 1611. Okay, at that time, the Protestants generally had the Geneva Bible was the accepted Bible, and it comes from the same root manuscripts of the King James. Okay, now to give a little bit of a modern history book about this idea, in this history book, A Basic History of the United States, written by Clarence B. Carson, here's what he states. But one work was vastly more important and had much greater impact on both the English language and men's outlook than all the work of the Elizabethan playwrights, poets, and scribblers. In 1611, the King James Version of the Bible was published. It was destined to become the Bible of English-speaking people well into the 20th century, now 21st century, and it is still the bestseller. There might have been a United States without the King James Version, but it surely would have been somewhat different than it has been. So that's quite a comment about the influence of the King James Bible upon this nation. So in 1607, the first permanent English settlement was named after King James himself. In 1609, the island of Manhattan, New York, now I'm using these names because these are the names that are used today, was discovered by Henry Hudson. Of course, the river is named after him in 1609. And the Dutch laid claim to the area, which later was called New Netherlands. And of course, the Dutch, their religious influence was the Reformed faith. Protestant, Reformed, Calvinism. Okay, the Pilgrims landed north of Virginia, which became known as Plymouth of Massachusetts of New England. Now, the Pilgrims were Puritans, and they rigidly observed the forms of their form of Christianity in Calvinism. They were dissenters or separatists from the Church of England. Now, if you go to this general area today, there is, or at least there was, I remember my wife and children, we visited the Plymouth Colony replica, where they had actors and actresses that behaved as the Pilgrims. And it was a very enjoyable experience. And in one of the houses, I noticed they had a very large Bible. It was a Geneva Bible. And these people limited their knowledge to 1620, 1621, something like that. And of course, as tourists, you try to get them off that date, but they stuck right to it pretty good. And so I asked them if they had heard about the New Translation, meaning the King James Bible, if they limited themselves to 1620. One individual, one of the actors, said to me, "Do you know about the New Translation?" "Oh, yeah." I said, "Yeah, a little bit." And he disapproved the New Translation. He liked the Geneva because the Geneva had Calvinistic notes in there. In another house down the little way in the Plymouth Colony replica, I asked another individual. I don't know if this was William Bradford. I think it was William Bradford, or the actor playing William Bradford. And I asked him about the New Translation, referring to the King James Bible, and he approved of it. Now, here is an example of a reprint of the Plymouth Plantation. And this is the account of William Bradford's history from 1608 to 1650. So this is what I'm saying about history books, is you go back to the people and get what they actually said. Now, in this account, in this historical account, penned by William Bradford, he states on page 1, as is well known, ever since the breaking out of the light of the gospel in England, so there's a great revival in England, the Reformation, Martin Luther, and all those great reformers, which was the first country to be thus enlightened after the gross darkness of popery had overspread the Christian world. Satan has maintained various wars against the saints from time to time in different ways, sometimes by bloody death and cruel torment, at other times by imprisonment, banishment, and other wrongs. He writes further, ever since the truth began to spring and spread after the great defection of that man of sin, the papal Antichrist. Whoa, wowee. That's why the pilgrims fled from Europe. That's why they fled from Europe. They were fleeing the persecution of a religion. Okay, here's some more things. The very first thing the pilgrims did when they came into the shoreline, when they got on land, the first thing they did is the first act of the pilgrims was a prayer and praise to God. Not Allah, to God. And they said, being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to the land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. Okay, and so what were some of the first words that were penned by William Bradford is what I read. And to repeat this, wherein I highlighted it here, the gross darkness of popery, which had covered and overspread the Christian world. Now, obviously, the beliefs of the pilgrims in Calvinism was an unscriptural belief. Now, right there, maybe you Calvinists, if you're listening, how dare you say that? Calvinism is biblical. Well, okay, if Calvinism goes against free will, how can you accept the belief of your free will? I was predestinated not to be a Calvinist. But even at that, God uses imperfect people. Another failure or an unscriptural belief of the pilgrims were that they failed to rightly divide the word of truth. I'm not, judging them for these things. It's just a matter of biblical understanding, where they took Acts 2 verse 44 in that passage about the Jews at that time had all things in common. Now, Acts 2:44 is what no Acts 2:38 proponent practices. But it says in Acts 2:44, and all that believed were together and had all things common. Now, that's not a biblical concept per se. Okay, and in this history book, this is a history book of the United States. This was written by a gentleman more so from the viewpoint of the Southerners after the so-called Civil War. So I would dare say this is probably closer to the truth than anything written by a Northerner. But even at that, he writes this: the harvest of 1622 was scanty, and the settlers would have suffered greatly had it not been for the friendship of the Indians. One of the causes of scarcity was the deep religious feeling of the leading Puritans, who had desired, in imitation of apostolic times, to have a community of property. Socialism, communism. It didn't work. But even amongst the Puritans, there were some who would not work as long as they were permitted to eat the fruit of the labor of others. And so the system was changed, and in the spring of 1623, each family had allotted a parcel of ground to cultivate for itself. All had now to work for themselves and to do without the necessities of life. After the harvest of that year, there was never any general want of food. This is why, the free enterprise and being rewarded for your labors always works best and is a biblical approach. You see, the pilgrims, yes, they were believers. Yes, the Lord used them. They weren't perfect in their Bible understanding. A perfect example of this is how the colony of Rhode Island was founded by Roger Williams in 1636. Roger Williams came to the new land. He was raised and educated in the Episcopal faith. He first settled in Salem, Massachusetts. And of course, right then, the liberals and the leftists, Salem witch trials. Like I said, I'm telling you that our nation wasn't perfect because it has imperfect people. They were wrong in executing the witches under the rightly dividing the word of truth. Okay, so Roger Williams preached to the Puritans, but he also became acquainted with the local Indians and began to learn their language. Why? To convert them to Christianity. Now, he also, at this time, was teaching what he called soul conscience, or the liberty of the soul, where he was teaching on the free will of man, where he should not be forced to worship against the dictates of his conscience. Oh, the Puritans, woohoo! They didn't like that idea. These Calvinists didn't like that idea. You say, even though the Calvinist viewpoint of these people, they did not appreciate the religious persecution of the Catholic faith, but when they got in charge, they did practically the same thing. Now, they weren't as ruthless as the Inquisition, but they banished them. The Puritan fathers deemed Roger Williams' teaching heretical and seditious. You see, what was they deemed heretical and seditious? Roger Williams taught that the civil magistrate ought to restrain crime, but never control opinion, like the tech companies are trying to do now, as an infringement of the rights of the conscience. He taught that one should purchase any land from the Indian. They should make an agreement with the Indians. Why? Because right of ownership. Now, in 1635, he was convicted, he was tried and convicted, and was made to flee in the winter of 1635. I mean, oh no, they didn't kill him right up like the Catholicism did, like the priest and the Pope in the Inquisition. They just banished him in the wintertime. He wandered alone for 14 weeks until he settled in an area, a certain selective area. So this would have been in early spring of 1636. But Governor Winslow notified him that he was still in the Puritans' jurisdiction. So he and 5 other friends left, settled in an area that's now Providence, Rhode Island, with an agreement with the local Indians. And in the summer, his wife, children, and other friends joined him. Now, they made an agreement amongst themselves that civil governing body with the exercise of unrestricted religious liberty. This is where the free exercise of liberty was birthed in the new land. In 1639, at Providence, Roger Williams, in a process, became a dissenter of the Episcopal faith. He was baptized by a Baptist preacher, and Roger Williams organized the best of our knowledge, the very first Baptist church in the new land. And if you go to Providence, Rhode Island, there is an area with a building that commemorates this truth. Rhode Island established the freest form of religious liberty in the colonies. The other colonies established Protestant faiths, Puritans, Calvinism, the Anglicans, which is also that, and they forced their, and then Episcopalian, Church of England, Maryland, of the 13 was the only one with the established faith of Roman Catholicism. Okay, so there's the beginning of the colonists. You can go back and research this yourself, and you need to research this yourself. And this is where you can learn the true heritage. Go back and get the wordings and the writings of the people who lived during this time. And if you have an honest bone in your body, you're going to have to agree with the president of Argentina, who stated, South America was settled by the Spanish who came to South America in search of gold, but North America was settled by the Pilgrim Fathers who went there in search of God.